2018 is now called to order. Councilmember Goodspeed will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Councilmember Cooper?
Here.
Councilmember Beaton?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski?
Here.
Councilmember Goodspeed?
Here.
Mayor Smith?
Here.
Councilmember Grabowski?
Here.
Councilmember Pontiac?
Here.
City Manager?
Here.
City Attorney?
Here.
DPW Director?
Here.
Finance Director?
Here.
Planning and Zoning Director? Public Safety Director?
Thank you. Public hearings, we have none.
Mayor Smith, I would like to add an item to our agenda tonight. I would like to add a motion to approve amending this year's current budget to include the sale of city property to date for local street repairs.
Need a second? I'll second that.
Any discussion? I have a motion by Councilmember Beaton, a second by Councilmember Pontiac to amend this year's budget to include the sale of city property for the repair of local streets. Is there any discussion?
Close enough. Good, yeah.
Would you please take roll?
Councilmember Cooper?
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski?
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed?
Yes.
Mayor Smith?
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski?
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac?
Yes.
I'm going to add that as item E under new business. Citizen comments on agenda-related items. This is an opportunity for citizens to make comment on items on the council agenda for this evening. If you wish to make comment, please come forward to the podium, state your name and address, and limit your comments to 5 minutes, please. Are there any members that would wish to make public comment?
Jim Matthews from 334 River Street. I've looked at the budgets the last few years and the budgets that's under development right now. And I think there's some consideration that should be given for the financial crunch that the city's in right now and has been for a while. In fact, that's why they would sell property to fix the streets. So with the potential for staffing and pensions coming under pressure, consideration should be given for the boundaries that the city should be engaged in. Two areas that put services of the city in competition with private sector providers are ambulance service and marinas. There's an ambulance service provider, there's marinas, and they're both high-cost items to the city. There may be more. I'm not the auditor to look at that thing, but I can understand that those two actually do drive cost and probably don't cover with the revenue they bring in. So, and government, my just basic opinion is the government entity shouldn't grow beyond their constitution. They shouldn't compete in areas where the people's money gets used to compete with private business. The costs and these ventures put pressure on the cost of staffing and providing the core infrastructure service that should be the domain of the city. And they're always held hostage to secure budget expansion. I know there's thought given to that right now. And subsequent tax expansion where that's possible. So at this time, I'd like to say governments should think these days, all the government entities should do less with less, not more with less. It shouldn't expand the government, but less activity for less money to begin bringing the cost of the citizen down. Thank you.
Are there any other citizens that wish to make a comment on agenda-related items? If not, we'll move on to the consent agenda. All items marked with an asterisk are on the consent agenda and considered to be by the city manager to be routine matters. Prior to approval approval of the consent agenda, any member of council may have an item from the consent agenda removed and taken up during the regular portion of the meeting. Consent agenda items include approval of minutes, cash balances, revenues and expenses, consideration of ordinance 18-05 peace disturbances, notification regarding the next work session, consideration of a resolution for administrative professionals week and day, consideration of the annual Ride for Silence, consideration of pinwheel placement for Child Abuse Prevention Month, and consideration of the American Legion poppy sales. At this time, council could take action to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Your Honor, I'd like to see the revenue and expense, that's B, removed from the consent agenda.
Okay. Make that item F.
I'd make a motion to approve the consent agenda minus B.
I'll second.
Any discussion or comment? Could the clerk please take roll?
Councilmember Pontiac,
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski,
Yes.
Mayor Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski,
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton,
Yes.
Councilmember Cooper,
Yes.
motion approved.
Thank you. New business. Item A, consideration of the purchase of a Vector sewer vacuum jet rotor. The 2018-2019 motor pool budget includes the replacement of our current Vector sewer vacuum jet rotor. The current Vector was purchased on a 5-year lease with a guaranteed buyback. The 5-year lease has expired. A quote was received from Jack Donnie Companies on a new truck with the same features as our current one. The quote is under the National Joint Powers Alliance pricing package number 022014-FSC in the amount of $403,653. Financing options will be bid out by the finance director when delivery is within 60 days. At this time, council could take action to approve the purchase of a 2018 Vector sewer vacuum jet rotor from Jack Donnie Companies.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
I have a motion by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, a second by Councilmember Grabowski.
Me.
Councilmember Goodspeed, excuse me. Is there any discussion?
I have a couple questions. This is in this year's budget, Mr. Taylor. It's in this year's budget, right?
We had planned to replace this truck in the current fiscal year budget. So we had budgeted that in the motor pool in the current budget. There's a couple things that happened. One, when this truck was purchased 5 years ago, the financing was arranged for at the time the council approved it. The money sat in escrow for the 6 to 8 months, I think it's actually closer to 8 months, until the truck was built. So when the truck was delivered, the note was already 8 months old. So that note came due, was that January, Ed? It came due in January, but we still had 8 months left of the 5-year life of that truck, if you will, before the guarantee buyback kicked in. So we were able to negotiate with Duhaney Companies to purchase the truck back from the leasing company at the guaranteed buyback that was agreed to in January. They paid off that final payment, and then the title's been signed back over to Jack Duhaney's, and they allowed the city to lease it back for presumably the 8-month period it would take to build the new truck.
And that was at a zero, right? No cost?
At zero cost. Yep, zero cost. So while it was programmed into the current fiscal year, by the time the truck is built and delivered, if council approves it, it will actually roll into the next fiscal year. And so we don't have that payment that'll come out of the motor pool this year.
What do we get for the buyback?
I believe it was 163,000.
And any advantages to leasing rather than purchasing?
Well, there are. One, and I wasn't a part of the purchase of this truck, but what we've been discussing now is there's a couple different options. Duhaney's willing to do another 5-year guaranteed payback or buyback, similar to what we just went through. We're also going to look at a 7-year buyback and 7-year or even an outright purchase, and then evaluate what we can get out of that machine. Because honestly, I think we can get at least 7 years out of it before we should be giving it back. So I think we can stretch those dollars out further.
Does the money on the buyback, does the money go to the motor pool, or does it go against the cost of the new one?
The guaranteed buyback paid off the balance of the purchase.
Is there any estimate, I know we were paying $28,000 a year on the lease, if I have the figures right.
On the current one.
From the budget. Is there any estimate on this one? It would appear to be quite a bit more expensive than the last one that was purchased.
The last one was about $388,000.
Okay.
Two things happened. The truck prior to the one that we just turned back had a trade-in value. So that truck was completely purchased, but had a trade-in value. So when the truck that we're using today, when that got purchased, the overall cost of it got reduced by that trade-in of the previous one, plus you minus out the guaranteed buyback of $163,000, and then you amortize that over the 5 years, and that became what the payment was. And I think it was about 28 or so.
28,000.
But we don't have the benefit of the value of a trade-in twice on the next one, so those will go up.
So it will go up.
Yep.
And then, Mr. Saylor, what, here we're being asked to approve a purchase from the 2018-2019 motor pool budget, and we have not yet adopted a 2018-19 budget. Is there an issue here?
I don't see there is one. You're gonna come back though again on the financing part
Right.
where you'll be required to approve that as well. And so I think the first step was to authorize the purchase, but then the financing part of it will come back to council for approval. So I didn't see a problem with that. This was a difficult thing to juggle on how we do this, the most economical and financially the best way for council, and so this was the decision.
Well, we're kind of going at it blind right now because we're going to approve the purchase of a $400,000 item in a budget that we haven't discussed and adopted yet, and we don't know what it's going to cost us in that budget at the same time.
And you'd be stuck with we're approving the purchase, that whatever it is going to have to be fit into the budget some way if you approve this tonight.
The only other option is if you want to take this up once the budget's adopted.
Mr. Bradford, there's no way to relatively ballpark guess what, I mean, if we had the options here, and it's like Mr. McCool is saying, we've got the possibility of a 5-year lease, possibility of a 7-year lease, possibility of an outright purchase, but we don't have those numbers to.
Right. I built in a 7-year purchase just as a budget assumption. It's about $67,000 a year. But as Jeff mentioned, there may be some programs through Doheny that might look more advantageous. There may be some other leasing options as we get closer. The problem with something that takes 8 months to build is if you finance it now, you've got to put that money in escrow and you're just paying interest for 8 months. That's unnecessary. I don't foresee any problems financing this when the unit, if it's approved, is close to delivery. That shouldn't be an issue, and at that point we'll have a little better idea of what the options are and whether we're going to keep the truck for 10 years or we're going to try to do a guaranteed buyback, that sort of thing. So I just built in an assumption into the budget. It could be less than that. It shouldn't be more than that.
Yeah, how much was that?
The assumption that I built into the budget that you're going to be looking at is about $68,000. I doubt that anything we come up with would be more than that. It could be less than that, depending on.
68, so that's going to be $40,000 a year higher than what we're. paying,
Right, for the reasons that Mr. McCullough described. And we did increase the motor pool contribution from the water and sewer fund to offset some of that, so. But again, it may come in less than that depending on what programs are out there at the time for financing it.
thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Just one more for Mr. McCullough, please. I wanted to wait till you sat down, then ask you to come back up.
Look at his smile.
I have a kind of an understanding of how valuable this piece of equipment is. Can you kind of give us some of what it's used for?
It's used literally every day. Some of the primary uses are for cleaning catch basins. We clean about 1/3 of the catch basins throughout the city. We use it to clean some places weekly, some places monthly, where we have sewers that are slow, or the way that laterals are tied in back up. It actually cleans pipes. So if they see a sewer that's moving slow or there's a backup, it cleans pipes. It's got, when we call it a jetter and a rotter, the jetter is a high pressure hose that's on the front of it. We can run it up and down the pipes to clean those. The vacuum portion of it is for cleaning catch basins and then also taking debris out of the structures. A secondary purpose of it is we use it for almost all of our excavations. So every time we have to dig up a water service or a sewer line that's broke, we do the hydro excavating with it. It's much safer to do that, much more efficient, because we can go down and we're not actually putting teeth in the ground. It vacuums out so we can see the utilities that are surrounding it. And like I said, it gets used virtually every day. We also have found a revenue stream for that machine. We've contracted with the state of Michigan to clean the catch basins along US 31, and so the city or the state pays us for that. The Department of Corrections has reached out to us, so on a monthly basis we're assisting them with some of their grease traps and their grinding mechanism prior to when their sewage enters our system. So we've got a good collaborative effort, and they pay the bill for that. The road commission, we help the road commission by cleaning some of the catch basins that's under the road commission's jurisdiction, or even some culverts, and we offset that with about $5,000–6,000 of effort that the road commission does to level our beaches each spring, because they've got the equipment and we don't. So each year the road commission manager and I match up, and sometimes those funds are just a little bit more one way or the other, but they seem to balance out pretty well. Last year or the year before, Filer Township contracted us to clean the catch basins for their township. So, and we've turned down work because I won't take on more work than what the normal maintenance things that we can do. I want to make sure that our system is protected and maintained first. But if we've got some capacity where we can bring some revenue back into the water and sewer system, we've taken on those.
So using that so much, how much maintenance does it require? Or do we get a extended warranty, or is there a lot of maintenance involved?
There's, the current machine that we have actually has 2 engines, so it's got all the normal preventative maintenance, oil changes, filter changes, that sort of thing. There's a lot of wear parts on it that we just systematically replace. Those parts are budgeted in our sewer collection budget, and so we've got a pretty good handle on that. The reason why these machines are recommended to be taken out of service after that 5 to 10 year period is because a lot of the internal mechanisms you think about when you're sucking or vacuuming that stuff, there's a lot of grit, the sand, the dirt, rocks, and so there's a lot of internal components that tend to wear. When we turn this machine back into Doheny, they'll probably put what they've told me is $50,000 to $80,000 to replace a lot of those parts, and then they'll resell it to a smaller community. So what we're trying to do is balance out to get everything we can out of that machine for the dollars we're paying, but not get into those $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 repair items. You know what I mean?
Sure, I understand. Thank you.
But, I would say, okay, we go out and buy a $400,000 piece of equipment, and then we contract with other entities or communities and use this equipment, that has a limited lifespan. Is there an economy in that? I mean, the more you use it, the more it wears, and the more maintenance you have. And it's nice to be generous, but when we're buying $400,000 pieces of equipment and increasing our budget expenses by $40,000 over the last item, I would really wonder, you know, if that's the right avenue to pursue.
Right. We've looked at it from two perspectives, and one, the machine that's before you tonight is virtually identical to the machine that it would replace. We haven't added anything new to it. They've got a different control package, which will make it easier to operate and safer to operate, but they're virtually identical machines. When we've looked at those contracted jobs, we have turned down everything in the private sector. The only time that we've done it is when there's governmental cooperation and where we feel that we can help other local governments, and in turn, you know, they're more willing to help us when we need that. And then there is a revenue stream that comes of it. So we've looked at it from a positive revenue stream and from a positive cooperative effort.
I give you one more question, which I hear from some of the taxpayers, and I believe I know the answer. Anyway, I know the answer I gave them. Why don't we just have somebody like Elmer's come down with one?
Well, there's a couple of reasons why. One of the things that one of our goals, or my goals personally within my departments, has been to reduce contracted services out and be able to do that work with our personnel. And I can name you probably at least 10 different examples of where that has saved the community money. When you've got a contractor, they've got profit and markup on top of that, those machine rates, and they're also not necessarily as available. We had a machine down, that Vector was down for repairs probably 3 years ago, and we had a sewer backup, paid around $1,000 for a company to come in and rod that sewer. A lot of it was travel time for their guys in the equipment. You know, we would have paid our people $100 out of, or probably $200 in overtime, you know, plus the use of that machine. So the efficiency, the fact that we're using it every day, the fact that it needs to be available on an emergency basis, but also scheduled daily. And we use it as an example when we were comparing the dozer rates with the road commission to what our rates would be, or what we charge as far as value to what we used for the road commission. And say it was about $4,000 worth. I actually called Elmer's and applied their rates to it, and it was almost double, probably 80% more by going with contracted rates. So for as much as we use that machine, I just don't think that contracting that out is an option.
I think if you have a main line break or a sewer break or something at 3 o'clock in the morning, you need it now, not
Absolutely.
not the next day. Or,
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you one more question.
Sure.
And when we do the trunk line and stuff for a DOT, they pay us the hourly rate of our employees plus all the fringe benefits and retirement and a depreciation allowance on top of that for our equipment. Do we charge a similar rate for use of our equipment?
Each year, and we've got all of our overhead multipliers are audited numbers that the state accepts each year. Each year, we submit an equipment list and an employee and labor list to the state of Michigan, with all of those overhead multipliers applied to the direct costs, and the state approves those. So the state contracts us to plow and maintain US 31 through town. It's kind of the same thing. So the rates that they allow us to, or the approved rates that they charge us, or allow us to charge them for that, we do the same thing with our Vector. And then we use those rates when we charge that out for any other job. We use that same rate structure.
So we have amortization of the equipment and everything included in that rate?
Those are the rates that are established by the state, so we use those, and then we tack on our labor.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Councilmember Cooper,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed,
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton,
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac,
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski,
Yes.
Mayor Smith.
Yes. Thank you. Item B, consideration of authorizing the replacement of City Hall boilers. City Hall has 2 boilers that were installed as part of the renovation in 2004-2005. They have reached the end of their useful life. One unit has failed, and the second unit is showing signs of failure. Our HVAC vendor of record recommends replacing the boilers with new, higher efficiency units. At this time, council could take action to authorize custom sheet metal to replace 2 boilers in City Hall with higher efficiency models at a cost of $28,800.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
I have a motion by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, a second by Councilmember Cooper. Is there any discussion?
I have some questions, maybe for Mr. Bradford, Mr. Taylor. When it comes to the financing of that, there's no way we can find the 28,000 in this current budget, or add it to the next year, the budget we're working on?
Either way, it's gonna come out of fund balance, so there's not enough room in the City Hall maintenance budget. There may be some left over that you could fund a portion of that, but we're projecting a large surplus this year again, so it seemed prudent to do that. There's no way to cut and pay for that 28,000 in the existing budget. They're too tight.
Okay, when you say large surplus, elaborate on that for me a little bit.
I think I mentioned the budget's gonna be north of $200,000, although if you guys act on the motion tonight to transfer the property sales, it may be less than that, but it's still gonna be 6 figures plus.
That's, our fund balance is gonna increase that much, is what you're saying?
That's what I'm projecting, yes. I have Chris Loftus from Custom Sheet Metal here too, who's our, the owner of our vendor of record, if you have any questions directly regarding the units.
No, my questions were mainly towards how we're gonna pay for it.
Yeah,
And
it's gonna need to
we're-
mainly come out of fund balance. There is $800 in an energy efficiency savings account that we've had set aside. We've used that for some LED fixtures in here, and we'll zero that out, but it's only $800.
I'm just kinda echoing back what I've heard you say, that we worry about our fund balance.
And we've added a lot to it in the last fiscal year, and we'll be adding to it this year, primarily because of reimbursements from the state that have far exceeded what we have budgeted. And so,
So our fund balance is, what you like to have it at? What percent are we?
the target is 20% of our general standard operating costs. We're not quite there, but if we have another year like we did last year, we'll be there.
Even with this 28,000?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I find it difficult to believe, since we haven't started next year's budget process yet, that we can't find $28,800 to pay for the boiler in the next year's budget. I mean, we haven't even, it'll be introduced tonight, then we have sessions going forward. I would suggest that there's a possibility we could fund it in the budget without going into the fund balance.
I'm not sure I share your optimism, but it all is, it's all with council priorities. So certainly if council wanted to reduce something and pay for it out of that, that's within their prerogative. I'm suggesting if we approve this and pay it out of fund balance for this year, it can be installed well in advance of the heating season. And we've had surpluses for the last 2 years. I guess the message I was trying to deliver is there isn't room in the current budget, and there isn't room in the city hall budget for the proposed budget for that type of an expense. That's an extraordinary expense that we don't typically budget for, that type of major maintenance.
We're not gonna start work on the boiler until we get out of this snowing, freezing season, which is surely at least another month along the road. I'm kind of at a loss to understand why we need to respond to this right now, when again, we are so close to starting the budgeting process, and we may not be able to find the money without going into the fund balance, but it's clearly stated in the budget, our responsibility is to have a balanced budget. When later in the year, we start pulling out of the fund balance to make up for revenue that we don't have or expenses we didn't anticipate, we don't end up with a balanced budget.
Well, respectfully, we're going to have a surplus this year, and in my view, that's the purpose of fund balance, is to pay for these unexpected items. But it's certainly council's prerogative if they'd like to push that into the next year's budget and try to find that money. I think it's going to be difficult to do so.
One of the things that as part of our budget process, we not only look at developing the subsequent budget, the 18-19, but the department heads are also charged with forecasting what the current budget is going to look like. I think that's where Ed's coming from, is we've looked at what do we need to get through this fiscal year, and he's saying that we've already looked at it. We don't have that extra $28,000 just because we're already projecting we're using the majority of what we have now.
If there's any questions on the boiler units themselves, I do have Chris here if you'd like to ask him any questions.
I've got no questions on a boiler, but as I read this and as I read through the literature, again, it's not like it's a right now emergency. It's showing signs of failure, and we need to address it in the near term, but we're not going to address it until spring or summer.
Well, we're down to one boiler. We can't operate one of them, so the system's designed to have two boilers. We're down to one. If that boiler fails, there's no heat in City Hall.
Then we have an emergency, yes.
Yes.
And that also is for cooling too, right?
It is not. The chiller is a separate unit. Yep.
Any further comments or questions?
How long do boilers supposed to be lasting these days? Because that doesn't seem like it's very old.
I'll let Chris address that. He's the expert.
Okay.
Good evening. Boiler longevity is based on a lot of things. Chemical treatment, maintenance, quality installation, quality service. So if you were to ask me a general rule of thumb, 12 to 15 years.
You being the person who is on our record as being our heating person, do you service these on a regular basis? Do we have a contract with you to?
Yes, you do.
So you make sure that everything's up to par. What is a warranty on these?
Warranty is based on a number of things as well. There's a standard 1-year warranty on parts. There's a standard 5-year warranty on heat exchangers. Typically those warranties are not needed when the chemical treatment, the water quality, the installation stuff is done correctly.
So the one that we have the cracked heat exchanger in, I'm just trying to fill my head with this, is not because we didn't service it, it's just because of age?
Correct. And we got a hold of these boilers, and I would have to look back, I believe it was 06, 07, we got a hold of these boilers to start maintenance them. They're not bad boilers, they're not efficient boilers though. So our carbon footprint, our efficiency ratings, our usage of gas and electricity isn't, it's the age of what they are now. So that's the problem that we run into with them. The sizing, they're very large. They have very big vent pipes on them. They went through their, I would say, I would like to see in a little longer time, but with what we're dealing with, we weren't able to do that.
Compare the efficiency with what we have now compared to what you're gonna put in. How much are we improving in efficiency?
Well, there's a couple of different ways, of course, to look at that too. Efficiency is rated on how long it runs compared to what it costs to run it. When we look at boiler efficiency, I can say that the boilers I checked today, the boilers are running at about 79% efficiency. The boilers that we're proposing to use are going to run at about 91%. Efficiency is a wonderful thing, but the controls inside of the boilers are what's really going to make the efficiency work, because the boilers that we have now are what they call a 4-to-1 turn down. The boilers that we want to use are a 10-to-1 turn down. So when a small portion of the building, say this room is calling for heat, we're going to come down in how much heat we put out because we don't need all the heat. We're going to be able to provide more comfort to the zones that are calling because we're not putting out as much heat.
Do the newer boilers emit less emission so that we're
Yes.
not?
Their carbon footprint is way less than what we have currently. I kind of compare it to a balloon. If you take our exhaust now and you blow the balloon up to a certain size, these boilers are probably going to be about 35% less than that. Now, I couldn't get the parts per million to work, but it's quite a bit less, and the boilers run less. They don't run as much. There's not as much usage, so the carbon footprint is a lot less.
Thank you.
Mr. Loftus, you talked about chemical treatment and maintenance. Does this bid include the appropriate fixtures or a process for monitoring the chemical and the condition of these boilers as they're operated?
Yes, sir. They, we have a company called Enerco that works with us, that works with you guys, that treat all of our buildings here. And it's a 1-year chemical treatment. They show up 4 to 5 times a year, test the water. I use that company throughout the whole city. They do a wonderful job, give me good reports on what's going on. And they also do the chiller for us too.
We maintain a maintenance contract with you, right? I
Correct.
think you said that, okay.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you. City Clerk, please take roll.
Councilmember Beaton.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed.
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski.
Yes.
Councilmember Cooper.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Yes,
Councilmember Pontiac.
Yes.
thank you. Item C, consideration of resolutions for Act 51 map updates additions. The state of Michigan requires additions and deletions to the official Act 51 map on an annual basis. The street administrator has performed an audit of the map and has identified a number of corrections. At this time, council could take action to approve resolution to add segments of Olga, First, Cedar, Hansel, Bruce, Regal, Division, Second, 13th Street, and Webster Court to the city street network and to include additions on the Act 51 map.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second it.
I have a motion by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, a second by Councilmember Beaton. Is there any discussion?
I have several questions. I'll start with, who is the street administrator? Okay, step to the podium, please. I have a question, a couple questions for you. This is done annually, but these streets have been around for a while.
The
So I'm
maps
just
are
wondering-
the maps are certified on an annual basis. We knew that there were some small discrepancies in that map, and so this year I went through the entire map with assistance from my staff, and we identified everything that we could find, little small, to try to make those corrections.
Okay.
For a long period of time, we had the Lighthouse Landing streets on the Act 51 rules, and they weren't dedicated to the city. I would go along with Councilmember Beaton's concern if we do this on an annual basis, and yet we find a multitude of streets all of a sudden. Do we need to audit more often?
When I've been at this for 5 years. The first year, there were some glaring deletions from that, or omissions from that map, and there were some changes from local streets to major streets that we went through in that first year. In fact, I think the first map came and it was due, and we signed it and got it out the door to meet the deadline. So it had been the second year that we did some modifications. We added 12th Street as an example by Manistee High School. That had been approved, it had been dedicated, but it had never been updated in the map. The last couple years, I've noticed that there's been some small discrepancies. When we went through and did a full audit of it, then we found, I think there was 18 maybe 20 that I had on the list. There's a couple that, one is an example that we're working on right now, that we have plowed a segment of street, and it shows up on site plans, it shows up in a PUD, but we don't have that dedication that we've been able to identify. So we're researching that one right now. It won't be put on the maps until we find that dedication, and then when we find it, or if we find it during this year, then we can update the map next year when they come out. So on an annual basis, now that I feel like this creates a very good baseline for us, and then it's just things that happen throughout the year that need to be adjusted on an annual basis. A couple of these are not things that anybody missed in the past. We've got 2 segments of 2nd Street between Pine and Spruce. Just as an example for you, the platted street, there's a platted right-of-way for 2nd Street between Pine and Spruce. There are houses at front on both sides of that platted right-of-way, but there's no pavement in between. There's no pavement within that right-of-way because there's a severe topographical changes. One side's real high on Pine Street, the other side's real low on Spruce. So what happens is everybody accesses from the alleyways. So we're making a pitch to the state of Michigan that since the city plows that and maintains that they should consider that as part of our street network, and we should get the revenue for maintaining that. So that's not something really anybody missed. It's just something that we're trying to be proactive on. Another segment is Hansel Street, and that is from 12th Street in Tamarack by Manistee High School. The gravel road that goes down to the well fields is actually a platted right-of-way in Hansel subdivision. Hansel subdivision was in Filer Township, but when the school property was annexed into the city, the entire plat was vacated except for that right-of-way. And if it was just the access to the well fields, I wouldn't have it on here. But that's a primary access to Manistee High School for their deliveries and their maintenance. It's their emergency access for their emergency loop around the building. The public uses that all the time to walk and stuff, so I feel that's an appropriate thing to put on the maps. So, and then the other ones there's several dead ends, north of River Street that are used for public purposes. We plow them. There's one that's on there that actually doesn't exist. So the next item that is before you is a few of those deletions, but just trying to clean this up the best we can.
We get Public 51 funds from the state based on the listed streets that we have.
Based on the lengths.
On the
Yep.
length.
Mm-hmm.
Does the state require any explanation as to why we're adding or deleting these segments?
Yes. So what I have before you is the resolution that's required by the state for each of those segments. What I will send is also a copy of the certified map. This has got all the markups on it. In your packet is the 2009B form that states it, but we also have to provide documentation, and so we've got files for each street segment that either shows that it's in a plat and what the length is, or we've got legal descriptions that define it. And when you get to the decertifications, places where there's actually been a vacation of the right-of-way. So there's a whole packet of information that I've got to submit to them to prove.
We're not going to owe them money for streets that have been listed that don't exist?
No, I've had that conversation. And if you look at the additions that we're proposing tonight versus the deletions, this will actually add more to the street network and increase the funds that we receive.
All of these additions are not necessarily paved roadways?
They're not required to be paved to be certified in the street network. There's one that is not, and that's Hansel Street.
Hey Jeff, where is Regal Street?
That's the second one, actually. When, was that 2008, that massive storm where we had flooding, we had the FEMA declared emergency, the end of 12th Street washed away. And at that time, the city built a gravel access to the last home that was at the end of Sweetenham Drive, and that was built within the Regal right-of-way. The property owners then got together and petitioned the city to actually vacate Sweetenham and not try to put that back, and now their primary access is from Regal Street. So that's actually the second gravelled one.
First time I ever heard of it.
Yeah, so if you're heading towards Lake Michigan on 12th Street, don't go to the end, but you turn on,
Left?
yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of that one. But if you turn left there, we have a pump station right there, and then Regal actually goes to the west from there.
Any other questions? Comments? Thank you. City Clerk, please take roll.
Councilmember Cooper.
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed.
Yes.
Mayor Smith.
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski.
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac.
Yes.
Thank you. Item D, consideration of resolution for Act 51 map updates, deletions. State of Michigan requires additions and deletions to the official Act 51 map on an annual basis. Street administrator has performed an audit of the map and identified a number of corrections. At this time, council could take action to approve resolution to delete segments of Duffy, Hastings, First, Elm, Sweetum, 17th Street, and Harvard Lane from the city street network, and to include deletions on the Act 51 map.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second it.
I have a motion by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, and I have a second by Councilmember Goodspeed. Is there any discussion?
Yes. I have a couple of questions. On Duffy, for the street administrator, what exactly are we deleting from Duffy?
There's a section of right-of-way between Monroe Street and Grove Street that was petitioned to be vacated this past summer, I believe, and council approved that. So that's just a normal course of business. It wasn't improved. We just had guardrail at the end. So the property, when vacated, 33 feet went to the west, 33 feet went to the east. The homeowners to the west built a large garage addition to their property, and
Okay, so, but Duffy still gets plowed to the
Yes.
dead end part?
the paved and improved portion of Duffy remains as part of our street network. The single block of unimproved that was vacated.
Beyond
just
the guardrail?
Taken off the map.
Okay, okay. That was one of my questions.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you. City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Councilmember Pontiac.
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton.
Yes.
Councilmember Cooper.
Yes.
Mayor Smith.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. Item E, added. Is a motion to apply the proceeds of city property sold in this fiscal year to local street repair for this year.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
I have a motion by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, a second by Councilmember Grabowski.
I have a few comments to make.
Discussion.
In looking at what has been given to Coldwell Banker to sell, they have approximately $1,212,000 worth of listed city property still to sell. And I believe to date, if we took out our expenses, such as sales commission for the recent sale on Monroe Street, We probably have close to $140,000 that have, because it goes directly into the general fund, because we don't have a dedicated millage or spot, I think, to put put that money without a motion by the council to say, hey, we would like the $140,000 that we've collected to date approximately to put in this year's budget. Now, in discussions with a couple people, if we don't have a use for it in this current fiscal year, it certainly stays within the budget, and it goes to 2018, 2019 is my understanding. It doesn't just go away, it doesn't evaporate, it just,
No, if council designates it for the streets, it would stay there.
Do we need to amend that budget to include all sale of city property, not just what we've sold? Is that,
I don't know, because I don't know what the intent is of council, if you're looking at to-date proceeds or beyond.
I'm looking at the sale of all city property. That's the motion I would like to make. All city property that is listed, that we've listed for sale, go to our streets. That's the way I would like the motion to read.
yeah,
Has the authority to take that action,
Anybody,
desire.
this will probably extend past, I mean, I'd love it if I'm a Realtor, I'd love it if I could say, hey, we could see that all sold in the next 365 days. But the reality is it might take 2 or 3 years to sell all of the property that we have out there. So if we address it and say to include the sale of all the city property tonight, that may extend beyond the current fiscal year and next year's fiscal year. Is that going to be something we can do?
Yes.
Okay.
But, one of the things when we recently did the contract, with Elmer's, I believe it was, for our street repair this year, one of the questions I asked of the city engineer as to whether or not that was potentially scalable if we had additional resources to put towards repair of our streets this year. With the money that we've already received, $140,000 approximately. I know there were some fees when I signed the closing paperwork the other day. Will we be able to scale the contract and add to maintenance activity this year?
Just thinking ahead in our transportation improvement program, we've got the projects that we've approved this year are mill and fill. One's a crush and shape. There are projects identified in the next year budget that are of similar and actually are very close in proximity to some of these. So there would be an opportunity for us to extend that contract with Elmer's to include additional street segments because it exceeds the 10% change order requirement. I would have to bring that back before council. But we did get very favorable unit prices from Elmer's. And I think that would be the only efficient way to get it, if you wanted to spend it in this fiscal year to get that done. There wouldn't be enough time to go through a whole nother set of bid documents, advertise it, bid it out, and award. But I'd be happy to explore that.
Anytime we can expand on the maintenance we're doing in a given year, I think we should take advantage of that opportunity to do so. As Councilmember Beaton points out, it could take years for the other surplus property to sell. I can't foretell what the requirements are going to be in the past. I don't have any problem obligating money that we have now that we've recently received. But I would feel uneasy. I mean, most of us are aware that in the past, a number of projects were leveraged against the oil and gas fund, which took our ability away to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to do things on this council until those debt services are paid off. I would know what the feeling is towards basically doing the same thing to future council members.
What we can do is bring council some options. I'd have to talk with Jeff, but potentially at the next meeting, bring a recommendation, worst case scenario, the first meeting in May, for, we'd be able to tell the council exactly how much property we've sold to date and what that would get us on projects that can be combined with what we plan on doing yet this fiscal year. And then council could make that motion at that time.
I'd rather go through with the motion tonight, though. And I would rather go through that it's the sale of any city property to go toward the repair of local streets.
That would be my intent. My intent of the motion was that I don't care if it takes 3 years, 5 years, that any property, city property sold, that money should be applied to the local streets.
Oh, and that's fine.
That was the intent of my motion.
The point that I was making is that we within the next, no later than the first meeting in May, staff would come back with a recommendation for council for the use of what we've sold already.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Okay.
so, and we would be able to tell you exactly how much money we have from property sales to date, and then make a recommendation on the best way to use those dollars on projects that we can complete before the end of this fiscal year. That's the point I was making.
That's good.
Just so I understand, rather maybe not extend a project, but maybe add it to another project, something like, anything, yeah.
As Jeff said, we've got our transportation plan and things that we might have looked at doing in the next fiscal year. Maybe there's some that we can pull in and use the contracts that we've let and do a change order and get those done yet this fiscal year. So that's the only point I was making, is that we'll be able to bring you something maybe as quick as the next council meeting, if not no later than the first council meeting in May, which should give us enough time to get that done by the end of the fiscal year.
Great.
Well, I believe what you're saying, but do we want to lock ourselves in with the property that can be sold later on? We're just gonna lock it into, I mean, we all want to get roads fixed, but I don't feel we should lock ourselves into that.
And that's a council decision. However you want to proceed, but if you're interested in using the money to date, which I think I'm hearing, then we'll have some recommendations within no later than the first meeting in May.
Then anything sold in the future would be earmarked to the same purpose, so.
I understand that.
One of the things council members need to bear in mind is, once this property is sold, it no longer is tax exempt. Somebody's gonna be paying property taxes on it and likely building on it. So we're gonna be increasing revenue through the sale of property with increased property taxes, which is the benefit of selling all this property. So we have one opportunity to just take the proceeds from the sale and put it toward our infrastructure. So I think it's a fair trade-off.
It's so hard to come up with money for streets. We look and look and look and try to figure out ways to come up with the money, the funds for local streets, and I look at this as one way of doing that. I'm just in favor of doing it that way.
Any further discussion? City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Mayor, if I could, the city clerk and I understood the motion to be committing the funds from the sales that have taken place. I'm hearing that there is some desire
To
maybe
date, yeah.
to include the commitment for all future
Sales to be
as well.
dedicated
So I
to
think
the streets,
you
the local
probably would-
street.
Yeah, you would probably need a motion to amend that motion then to reflect that.
Do we have to vote on the other motion?
But then you'd vote on the amended motion and then on the underlying.
Amend the motion to include the sale of all city property,
I second.
To local streets.
the local streets.
Is that, who was the second?
Second, or I think Aaron seconded.
I
Okay,
second.
all right. We have a motion to amend.
I'll make that motion.
I did already.
You already did.
You did.
Okay.
Okay.
We got to,
Aaron second.
we have a motion to amend by
Keep doing this.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, a second by Councilmember Pontiac. Any further discussion?
Are we voting on the amended?
The amendment.
The amendment,
The amend
not for,
motion.
okay.
Is that correct, Mr. Saylor?
Yes, you're voting on the amendment to the current motion that's pending.
So, any further discussion? City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Councilmember Cooper.
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed.
No.
Mayor Smith.
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski.
No.
Councilmember Pontiac.
Yes.
Approved.
Thank you. We have a motion, and it's by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, and a second by Councilmember Grabowski on the original motion to apply the proceeds thus far to local streets in the current year contract.
As with the amendment that was made.
With the amendment. Is there any further discussion? City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Councilmember Cooper.
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed.
Boy. I'm gonna. I don't know. Probably gonna have to say no at this point.
Mayor Smith.
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski.
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac.
Yes.
Thank you. Brings us to item F, discussion of revenues and expenses. I've got a question on legislative, Mr. Brandford. I know we had travel and training recently from Councilmember Cooper and myself at the MML. Is probably not in here because this looks like it closed out the 2/28. When I look at our budget for legislative, we're still going to have, as this reflects, not considering those costs, that we've got $3,000, a little over $3,000 still available there, and most of our supplies and operating expense, $1,356, still available. What's going to happen with those funds at the end of the year?
Well, unless they're moved or expended, they just become part of the fund balance. They don't lapse. The appropriation lapses at the end of the fiscal year.
Okay.
Part of it, I did look into the legislative, because City Manager Taylor said that was where you had some of the concerns. Not all of those expenses, come evenly through the year. So for example, in the operating supplies, there's $1,000 for a recognition event. So that doesn't typically happen if it is going to happen towards the end of the year. We assume a certain number of people are going to attend a certain number of conferences when we're building those budgets. If fewer people go, then there's savings there. So, and the expenses aren't even throughout the year, as you've noted. So, but the answer to your question is, if those aren't spent, they just stay in the fund balance.
Okay. So it just rolls into the fund. It doesn't go into any other account?
No.
Okay. I asked that question because the budget's down next year, which it should be, because since I've been on council, I haven't used all the travel and training expenses that are in there, and at some point in time, it needs to be adjusted to a more realistic level. There's no sense in budgeting more than you're going to use. Could you give me some kind of a rundown on what happens with the various street funds in the budget? I mean, we get transfers in, we get transfers out. It is quite difficult to understand where we are in a particular moment in a cash position.
I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but I'll give it the best shot that I can. The street funds themselves get revenue from primarily the state of Michigan through the gas tax, through Public Act 51. Because of the aggressive street program, Transportation Improvement Fund, we've had to supplement those sources of revenue. So there's money that comes into both the local and the major street fund from the Capital Improvement Fund and from the general fund to supplement that. There's also money that goes from the major street fund to the local street fund for two purposes. One is to pay off a bond that did about, a mile of reconstruction of local streets as part of the Cedar Street separation. They called them the Cedar Street Orphan Streets. The local street fund can't afford that, so the major street fund has the ability to transfer dollars. So part of that transfer into the local street fund is from the major street is for that project. Then there's additional monies on an annual basis that are transferred from the major street fund into the local street fund to fund local street reconstruction and resurfacing. So there's basically those three types of transfers into local streets: the general fund, the capital improvement fund, and the major street fund.
Okay. There are some new, or some things that are well over cost, SUTA. What?
So that's a rate for the state unemployment tax that is established by the state, and the state gives us our rates in January, and they tripled it. So it only applies to the first $9,000 of taxable income, or of wages of an employee. So yes, it has gone up significantly, but the gross dollar amount isn't all that significant in terms of the budget.
Okay. Are there overtime concerns?
There are overtime concerns, but the department heads have been addressing those by trying to move monies within different line items. That's one of the new procedures we've implemented to try to insert a little bit more discipline than we already had into the process, where you have to identify if you have an overage on an account, where you're going to take it out of, and if you can't, then it becomes a council budget amendment. You'll recall we did a budget amendment several meetings ago. That's earlier than we've done them in the past. We'll probably have another one done after the end of the third quarter, and then one at the end of the year. That's just an attempt to be a little more proactive.
Because we have for police an overtime spotlight grant.
Yes.
Has that always been there?
At one point, it was called the underage drinking grant. It's gone by different names. That's grant reimbursable overtime. So if we partner with the sheriff and we go incur some overtime for that grant, it gets reimbursed by the state. And I don't think we use as much of it as they anticipated this year.
Okay. And for the fire department, we have overtime FFPA 604. What?
Oh. Public Act 604 is a state law that allows firefighters to get extra hours of overtime depending on how many days they work in a certain pay period. It's statutory overtime. We used to include that in the regular overtime numbers. We've broken it out now because it's something that's out of the chief's control. It's just a byproduct of the schedule, and we wanted to track that separately.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
It brings us to notices, communications, and announcements. The report from Launch Manistee has been canceled for this evening. Introduction to fiscal year 2018-19 budget.
Council's received all their copy of their budget, and hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at it. We're certainly not going to do a deep dive by any means tonight, but we took what council identified as their priorities, that number one being a balanced budget without using fund balance. We were able to accomplish that. And then you wanted additional monies for roads. Some of that's already was taken care of earlier in the agenda. Also, because of the action that the state took several years ago, we are getting more from the state for roads. And then recently, the governor signed a declaration to dedicate another $175 million to roads, and it was dispersed throughout some type of a formula. We just found out this week that we're going to be getting between 55 and 60,000,
Like 55.
55,000 extra that we just found out about that we can plug in. So, you know, those are the two things that council directed us to focus on, and we were able to accomplish both. So I'm gonna have Ed just go through and hit some of the highlights of the budget, and again, this is just gonna be an overview, and we'll dive deep into it at the work session.
Can I just ask one quick question on the 55,000? That's for, what's the breakdown between major and
I haven't
local
seen the
streets?
check come through yet, so I don't know how they allocate that. I'll have to look at that and see. Typically, it's 75-25 major local, but this may be unearmarked. If that's the case, then it could be dedicated to local streets if that's what council desired.
Okay,
But we'll
thank
have
you.
to find out. Okay, so I think that's a very interesting picture of the pier and the waves crashing, and I had hoped that we were done with that kind of weather, but apparently not, at least for another week. I just wanted to quickly run through the budget. This is similar to the presentations you've seen in past years. General fund or citywide budget highlights. As Thad mentioned, the general fund budget's balanced without using any reserves. We did have a taxable value increase of 1.1%. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. We did raise some fees and the schedule of fees, primarily to do with some planning and zoning special use permit type fees that Denise did an analysis of and discovered that, you know, we probably needed to charge more to cover our costs. That provides for staff wage increases. It fully funds our MERS contributions, and we've been able to secure a reduction in health insurance costs this year. We've maintained our scheduled water and sewer rate increase. We had to increase our refuse rates to cover the rising costs there. And this is one of the highlights. The budget funds about $1.9 million in street work in the upcoming fiscal year. About little more than half of that's local and the rest is in major. And then we also have reduced operational support for the Ramsdale Theater. Looking at the overall city budget, it's about $17.2 million. Its increase is about $700,000 over last year. That number fluctuates quite a bit depending on grants and things that we might have. But the primary difference is that we have more water and sewer capital outlay, and that relates to the sewer separation closing as we just kind of ramp into that. You can look at the graphs down below just quickly. About 42% of the overall budget is water and sewer, and 36% is general fund, so total of about almost 80% between those two funds. And then if you look at the type of expense, about 74% of it's operational, 12% of it's debt service, and about 14% of it is capital outlay. General fund, our total budget is about $6.3 million. And as I mentioned, it uses $0 of fund reserves. If you look at the chart, which is our general fund balance going back to 2002, you can see that my projection for 2018 has us at a higher amount than we've been at in the past since 2002, which is a good place. With that said, the budget has grown, so it's not as high a percentage as maybe it has been in the past, but it's still getting more comfortable than what it was in the 2007 to 2010 period. Key points in the general fund. The presentation of the budget has changed a little bit due to we adopting the new state chart of accounts, which is mandatory. So for example, there used to be an attorney department and there used to be an engineering department. Those aren't in the state chart of accounts, so they've been moved within the general operating department. There's a few other changes. Elections, we had to break out separately, so we did that. Same way with Board of Review, we had to break that out separately. It was just the state requirements. Another thing that changed in the presentation was the 2010 capital improvement bond. We used to show that as transfers in from 3 funding sources into the general fund and then the general fund paying it. Once we worked through the USDA rural development loans and how they wanted to see the information, plus some changes in the chart of accounts, we decided to take that out of the general fund. So we removed the expense out of the general fund. We also removed the transfers in, so it's a net wash, but it does reduce the overall size of the general fund budget. Those expenses are now going to be booked directly in the funds that they're paid out of, which is the capital improvement fund and the water and sewer fund primarily. Taxable value growth. This isn't something that council needs to be aware of. So we did have a 1.1% increase in taxable value. The inflation rate this year was right around 2%. So everything else equal, if you had no new construction, no sales, no change, you would expect generally taxable value to go up around that inflation rate. Well, the reason that it went up less than that is because of, even though the market is fairly strong, Molly had to make some adjustments in some areas to reflect the market. That was primarily in Maxwell Town. The other thing to keep in mind is of that 1.1% taxable value that we actually had, quite a bit of that is captured because it occurred in the DDA district and or Brownfield district. So our net tax revenue only increased by about 0.4%. Our staffing is stable. There's no new full-time or part-time equivalencies. As I mentioned, we have a health insurance reduction. Our operational costs show modest increases, and the budget as proposed has no service reductions. General fund revenue, exclusive of the accounting change for that capital improvement bond, which I talked about, our revenues are up about $201,000 or 3.2%. As I mentioned, tax revenue's flat, approximate increase of about $15,000. Our state revenues are up quite a bit, and that's both in the personal property tax reimbursement and in revenue sharing. One of the things that we've experienced the last 2 years, and that's why our fund balance has gone up, is that the reimbursements we're receiving for our personal property tax based on the state formula have far exceeded what anybody expected, and that's across the state. And that's because of the way the law was written and the way the revenues came into the state. They've talked about reallocating those dollars through an act or through the revenue sharing, but they haven't passed any legislation to do that yet. So instead of not budgeting for any of that extra revenue, because we know we're going to get some, we budgeted for a portion of it this year, where in the past we were just basing it on what we thought we should be getting. So that's part of the reason we have that increase there. Also, constitutional revenue sharing is up. Sales fees and charges are also up about $66,000. There's money in there for some medical marijuana licenses and the $5,000 fee. There is an additional increase in DDA reimbursement, and we're expecting some increase in ALS. Other revenue in the general fund is basically flat. And you can see this chart shows the breakdown of revenue. Tax revenue is about 54% and state revenue is about 14%. It wasn't too long ago where tax revenue was a higher percentage. It was almost 65%, I think. That's gone down over time as our tax base has declined. And also state revenue used to be much more important in the budget as well. So we've had to offset that with other revenue sources. This chart here shows our property tax revenue since 2008. We're still below 2008 levels on property tax revenue, if you can believe that. And that's all a result of the way the state has their funding system. It's easy to lose value, but it's difficult to gain it back. And that's part of the reason why the MML says we have a broken municipal finance system, and you can see it on that chart. But it also mimics the chart on the right, which is our taxable value growth rate. You can see from 2009 on, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically 6 years of negative or flat growth, and then a big drop in 2016. Only just the last 2 years have we had a small increase. So that has put a lot of challenges on the general fund. Revenue sharing, we've talked about this. It's down from $999,000 back in 2000. It has increased in recent years, not so much because of the state doing the statutory revenue sharing, but because of the constitutional revenue sharing, which grows along with sales tax revenue. That can't be touched by the legislature. You can see, though, if we had maintained that level of just below $1 million, we've lost about $5.3 million over that time period if it had just stayed flat. Expenses in the general fund, again, exclusive of that accounting change on the debt issue, we're up about $223,000 or 3.7%. This chart breaks down where the major areas are. I've combined DPW and parks because they're similar and they kind of do, use the same workforce of about 1.7 million. Police is 1.2 and fire's a little over $1 million. You can kind of see how that breaks down. General fund employees, we're no net increase this year, 46.5 employees. We did add 2 last year, but you can see historically we're at a fairly low level. It was as high as 53 back in 2004. The right 2 charts represent all employees, not just general fund. You can see public safety is about 38% of those employees, and public works is a little bit behind that at 28%. By type, we have about 76% unionized and 24% non-union. Downtown Development Authority, as you know, they capture taxes in our downtown district. Absent any action from council, the DDA will sunset in 2020 when the bond expires. So it takes an affirmative action of council to extend that TIF plan. The city did request for an increased allocation to up to $40,000, which is an $18,000 increase over what we had last year. The DDA did not include that in their budget, so that's going to be something we're going to have to reconcile when we're going through the budgeting. Council has to approve the DDA budget, however, as you know. The chart on the right shows what the DDA captures, or is estimated to capture in this coming fiscal year. City operating is about 58% of the revenues, or $152,000. And then you've got county operating at $47,000, the community college at $26,000. All the county voted millages like the Council on Aging and Dial-A-Ride are combined at about $27,000, and then about $10,000 for city refuse. So if the DDA was not capturing those, that money then would come back to those different taxing jurisdictions. Water and sewer fund, the budget's about $7.2 million. It does include some of the corrective action plan spending. Our proposed rate increase is 3.5%, which is consistent with what the rate study recommended. That'll mean for a typical 6,000 gallon user a monthly increase of about $2.87. One thing to keep in mind is we're probably going to want to do a refresher on our rate study this year to make sure that those rates are still going to carry through with all the projects that we have to do, and there'll be more on that to come, but that's probably going to be something that we're going to want to do before we enter into that second rural development loan. Our historical rate increases are still less than water and sewer inflation as measured by the Water and Sewerage CPI index that the federal government has, though. And the reason for that is we think our system is old and has lots of needs, but across the country systems are old and have a lot of needs, and we've been pretty systematic about investing back in our system, so we don't have as many needs as some. And our city rates are still competitive with other communities based on a study that was published a couple of years ago, some benchmarking. Water and sewer key points. We need to complete our SAW grant work. We have to implement agreements with Manistee and Filer Charter Township. That's happening as we speak. And we need to finish negotiating the sewer agreement with Manistee Township as well, and those conversations are ongoing. We need to close that last combined sewer outfall. There's going to be significant engineering and construction efforts, and we have to incur additional debt in 2 phases. And as I mentioned, we're going to want to confirm our rates are adequate to support the needed borrowing. It's going to be close, but we will want to refresh that rate study just to be sure. Typical bill, this shows at different volume usages with the proposed 3.5% rate increase. Again, a 6,000 gallon user for water and sewer would pay about $84 a month. 6,000 is what we used to use as kind of the standard for a customer. What we're finding is that the typical customer is more between 4,000 and 5,000. So I would say a typical bill is probably around $67 for a family. You know, obviously if you're a single living alone, you don't use that much, but families do use more. Streets. This chart shows, and this was presented in the annual State of the Streets report that came out just a few months ago. A condition of all the streets, both major and local, we have 44% good and 12% fair. So about 56% of our streets are in that PACER category of 10 to 5, and we have 44% in the poor category. You can see the progress that's been made since we started doing asset management back in 2008. Number of good streets has gone from 12% to 44%, which is a sizable increase. The fair streets have gone from 30 and declined to 12 because a lot of those have moved into the good category. And we've also been able to reduce the poor streets by about 15 percentage points. Key points. We shrunk the transportation improvement plan this year to only be a 4-year plan. It's the current budget year and 3 years looking out. The reason for that is it was just too difficult to look out that far and try to accurately predict what our revenues were going to be for transfers in. So we think doing it in this method gives us a much more firm picture of what the projects are going to be. A lot of that also is the fact that, for at least for local streets, many of those projects are going to require sewer and water work, and if there's not funds to do that at that time, then it's going to be more challenging, and we want to be able to accurately predict that so we don't set expectations that aren't met. Increased state funding is continuing to kick in, which you'll see on some graphs in a minute. The plan calls for about 1.5 miles or 19 blocks of street work, primarily on local streets. As I mentioned, about $1.9 million in street projects. And then the supplemental funding this year, not including transfers from the major street to the local street, but from outside of the street funds. The general fund is $80,000, which is a $5,000 increase. That's what has been in the plan. And then the capital improvement fund is about $94,000. As I mentioned, Major Street Fund does support the local street fund. It does $100,000 for projects for local streets, and then the $80,000 is the debt service that went for local streets back when we did the Cedar Street project. These charts show roughly what the state funding is projected to be. You can see it goes up quite a bit. From fiscal year last year, when it's fully phased in 2022, it's going to be about a $300,000 a year increase for major and about $100,000 for local, assuming it goes according to that plan. Our tip that's included in the budget, it anticipates about $4.5 million in spending over that 4-year period. 2.2 on local, 2.2 on major, assuming we get two $375,000 grants, one of which we're pretty confident in, the other one, is to be determined, but it's a good candidate for it. And assuming we get those grants, that averages about $1.12 million in work on streets over that 4-year period. Total work to be done is 3.75 miles of streets or 49 blocks, roughly 1.13 miles of major and 2.6 of local. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, we did, Jeff, how many miles of slurry seal did we do when we did that? For
About 6 miles.
Yeah, so we did 6 miles of streets a little while ago, the stuff out in front here and on Maple Street and some of the streets that were in good condition to extend their life, and that was a $450,000 project. The reason we're not doing as much here is because now we're getting into heavy rehabilitation and reconstruction, which costs way more per mile, so that's why you're seeing that difference. Over that time period, we've got about $350,000 in general fund allocations and about $470,000 in capital improvement fund allocations. And there is a page in the budget that refers back to a recommendation that was made by the Street Ad Hoc Committee, which is once we've shown some progress in addressing our streets, which I think you can clearly see from the graphs we have, is that the council consider putting a Headley override amendment on the ballot. And there is a page in the budget that talks about how much money that could potentially raise and what that would mean for work that could be done on the street. So that's something that administration is hopeful council will discuss and see if that's a viable option. Because I don't think the facts of the matter have changed, that's probably going to be one real viable way of raising more money if council wants to address streets faster. This map shows the proposed budget and the 3 out years of streets that are proposed to be done. Yes, Quincy Street is on that map. That was asked to be put on it by council. It's in fiscal year 2022. Moving on to our refuse system. Again, just for clarity, we have a hybrid system where we have user fees and taxes that pay for that. Over time, the user fee piece has grown, the tax piece has shrunk, again, because of our declining tax base. And we need to raise revenue to be able to pay the contract fees for refuse. Our rates need to be adjusted annually. Our fund reserves need to be closely monitored. The chart there shows where we had a planned drawdown of our fund balance because we had been actually taking in too much money in prior years. And that has drawn down to a point in 2018 where it's actually lower than I'm comfortable with. And so we do want to build that back up somewhat, and that's kind of what this projection shows. So we'll monitor that year to year. We'll get to a spot that we're comfortable, and then we'll just maintain it at that point. The refuse rates, it shows a 14.6% increase. That's similar in magnitude to what we had last year, but what that really means is if you have a tidy tote as a residential customer, you're going to pay $25 more a year or $2 a month more. So the percentages are big, but the dollar amounts are small. But that's what's needed in order to offset the additional contractual costs, which go up every year, the fiber hauls, and other inflationary things that happen in the refuse fund. Marina, this slide has not changed one letter from last year. The marina operations continue to struggle to generate enough income to pay for operations and service staff. That hasn't changed. The revenues are dependent on weather, fishing, and fuel prices, all of which are kind of out of our control. Our new building has not really increased boater traffic as much as we've expected. There has been some uptick in traffic, but until I see a trend on that, I'm going to say it's been fairly flat. And the Harbor Commission has made increasing revenue the #1 goal, but that's pretty difficult to do in that operation. So we're still assuming a $65,000 in support from the Capital Improvement Fund. I don't see that support going away until that debt is paid off because we haven't shown any ability to raise more revenue down there. And even with that, the budget is very tight with very little cushion. I know there's a number of docks there right now that are underwater. Rather than paying tens of thousands of dollars to raise them, Jeff has been working with the harbor master to do a pilot project where they're just putting a a raised platform on those docks so that they're usable this year to see how that's gonna work at a lower cost. Just some quick charts on the marina. You can see the transfers in versus debt service. There's about a $3,000 difference. Debt service is about $63,000. The transfers in are about $65,000, but that's necessary to keep the marina at a fund balance. It's not a deficit. You can see dockage fees have been fairly flat. They've fluctuated quite a bit, but overall, right around that $70,000 mark is what we tend to get every year. Boat launch, in contrast to the marina, is self-sustaining. It is vulnerable to downturn in fishing conditions. We've seen that. When there's been poor years, we get less traffic. When good years, we get more traffic. I think last year was better than people were thinking it was going to be in terms of fishing. We did tap our reserves in prior year to fix the retaining wall at Arthur Street, but we still have fund balance there, and there are needs. We're going to have to replace our auto attendant probably in a few years, although we're going to make it last as long as it can. Again, a few charts here. You can see the sales do fluctuate. The low point there was when we were doing First Street construction, but they tend to be right around that $37,000 mark. And typically, most of our sales are in August and July, and then obviously they ramp down on either side of that. Capital Improvement Fund, that is funded by our 4% spending rule allocation from the Oil and Gas Fund. This year we've got about $391,000 in revenue, and we've got $366,000 budgeted for expense. Prior commitments are about $261,000. Current allocation to streets is about $94,000. And then current projects is about $25,500. One of that is the third payment on the financial management software that was approved. And then there is a new item for $10,000 to replace police sidearms. But that's the only new project that's in the Capital Improvement Fund. You can see here spending in the Capital Improvement Fund, 45% of it's for street improvements, 48% of it's for buildings, 7% is other. And you can see, absent any new obligated funds, those obligated funds start to drop off in fiscal year 2026. Oil and Gas Fund, we're all familiar with that. Our accumulated royalties are at about $7.5 million. Aztec has started back up production. We're starting to get royalty checks again. Hopefully that'll continue. Value of our portfolio, last I looked, which hasn't taken into consideration these stock market gyrations we've been having, but it was about $10.1 million. And our 4% spending rule generates about $391,000. You can see our oil and gas earnings over time. Again, we started investing in different assets in 2008-9. You can see our returns have increased dramatically since then, although 15 and 16 had a fairly flat year. And you can see that in the total oil and gas value where it climbed rapidly, but then it did drop off because we were taking more out of the fund than we were earning in those 2 years. But by and large, since we've been investing at like an endowment, we've earned a lot more than we've taken out of it, and that's why the balance has grown from $7 million to $10.1 million. And it allows for more spending based on that spending rule. Motor pool, as you know, it receives rent payments from the general fund and the water and sewer. This year we have $447,000 of budgeted expenditures for both prior commitments that have been financed and current purchases. In the motor pool this year, we have a few things budgeted. We have one more police car. We have a skid steer loader. We have one of the loaders and big loaders in the DPW. We have one pickup truck, and we have one mower. The thing to keep in mind about the motor pool fund is we have to take a look at that to make sure that we're going to be able to sustain it as we do every year. But what the projections are showing is that we're either going to have to raise more money for the motor pool, which isn't likely to happen much beyond inflationary causes, reduce the size of the fleet, extend the lives of vehicles, or maybe change service levels. And all three of those are looked at every year, and we haven't had an issue, but we're going to have to take a hard look at that. I know the mayor has some concerns about reflecting the true costs within the general fund and within the water and sewer fund, and say we are going to do a little bit of work on that to better allocate those costs so we can get a truer picture. But the takeaway on all this is the amount of money that's going into the motor pool right now, based on the projections, isn't enough to continue to sustain that. So as we've done every year in the past, since I've been here, we look at the motor pool and we adjust it accordingly. The motor pool is not set up to be a self-sustaining thing. We would need, off the back of my envelope calculation, probably up to a couple $100,000 a year more to go into the motor pool to actually make it self-sustaining. At that point, I'm not sure it even makes sense to have a motor pool. You should just pay for it on a pay-as-you-go basis. The motor pool was designed, at least in our community, to absorb those fluctuations from year to year. So we'll do some more work on that, probably come back at a later date and kind of go through that, but that's where we're at with it today. Ramsdale Theater, the budget assumes that the RRCA nonprofit continues to operate the Ramsdale and manage it. The allocation has once again been reduced from 60 to 55,000. That little chart shows the reduction of cash that's been going to support the Ramsdale Theater since 2009. Operations has been reduced from 107,000 to 55,000, which is about a 50% reduction. Capital allocations have gone from about 120,000 to zero, 100% reduction. And the debt service has gone from 178,000 to 108,000 by virtue of the fact that the roof note has been paid off. That's a reduction of about 40%. So overall, from the peak to what the proposed fiscal year 2019 budget says, that's a reduction of about 60% in operating support. In summary, the budget addresses council priority of balancing the general fund budget without using any reserves. General fund revenue growth needs to improve. That's the same story I've been preaching for several years now. The state needs to do something. We need to have more taxable value growth in the city. Our revenue needs to improve in the general fund. We have addresses healthcare costs in this budget, potentially significantly. We're discussing additional pension reforms with unions. That was something that council had asked us to do, and we're working towards that end. DDA TIF renewal and priorities discussion needs to occur. We've been having some discussions on that. There'll be more to come, but at some point that's going to have to be decided as to what direction we're going to go with the DDA. The water and sewer utility is stable right now, but the combined sewer overflow, the corrective action plan issue remains, and that plan needs to be executed on a very aggressive timeline that's being dictated by the MDEQ. We also do need to update the rate study just to make sure that we're still on track. The street work and the tip averages a little over $1.1 million per year, which is outstanding for the resources that we actually have. That's a big number. Marina revenues need to increase, as I mentioned, and in the oil and gas fund, the spending rule is doing its job. The asset allocation is doing its job to maintain steady income for projects, even with recent market volatility. That's what it's designed to do. And then also the Ramsdale Theater operating model is showing signs of success through enhanced fundraising. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Concerns and comments. Citizen comment. This is an opportunity for citizens to comment on municipal services, activities, or areas of city involvement. Citizens in attendance shall be recognized by the mayor for comment. Please limit your comment to 5 minutes. Letters submitted to council will not be publicly read. Are there any citizens that wish to make comment? If not, we'll move on to officials and staff. Mr. Taylor.
Nothing at this time.
City Attorney.
Nothing, Your Honor. Thank you.
City Clerk. Planning and Zoning Director. Mr. Bradford.
Nothing more.
Public Safety. Going easy. Public Works.
Nothing, Your Honor.
You don't want to make another trip? Okay. Okay, council members.
Yeah, Jeff, could you come back up there a minute? Jeff, how's it going with the Maple Street Bridge? I know they had a lot of problems with it. Are we getting anywhere with that?
We've made some great progress. Some of the issues that we were having last fall were that the bridge was functioning and operating, but it's a very technical piece of equipment, and there's a lot of limit switches that control when it stops, when it starts, and the speeds. Some of those had got out of adjustment. It's very complex. You can't just adjust one without affecting 10 other functions. So we actually have been working with the state of Michigan, and the state has agreed to bring in their technicians that work on all of their movable bridges. They see Maple Street Bridge as their backup to the US 31 bridge. So we started the conversations late last fall, and then we've continued. And when we did the testing last week, they actually had 2 of their electrical technicians that came up, went through it, and they wanted to understand that bridge, so they were here the entire day, walked through the plans, walked through the functions. So we also had our mechanic on hand. We had our electrician of record. So we built some institutional knowledge. We got some adjustments done. There's still a little bit more to do, but nothing catastrophic at this point. Yep.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.
Councilmember Beatty.
I don't have anything other than that I hope the snow goes away by the time I leave work tomorrow. And I hope everybody else is looking forward to a nice spring.
I want to go skiing.
Go ahead.
I'm good.
It's my month to read the anniversaries, and for 14 years of service, Larry Fenner. Brandon Prince has also did 14 years of service with the city. Jeremy Randall just has got 2 years, and safety.
Bring the chief up, give him his card.
Chief Kozel,
1 year anniversary.
1 year anniversary.
What's his name?
What?
Beginning.
Come on up, Badoo. No, we gotta give him his card. He gets a card with our signature. Lucky you.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Councilmember, you got anything? Yeah. Nothing? You got something?
know, I'm okay.
Nothing, Your Honor.
Councilmember Praniak. I would like to thank Public Safety, Steve Smelling, for the quick action the other day. Having coffee, and someone came up and says, you know, there's a hypodermic land right by the sidewalk down at the schoolyard. And they thought they saw a cell phone thrown over the fence and stuff. And I went by there later. I'd say I have to be distressed that people are not more observant of some of our ordinances and more considerate of other people. The dog droppings right in front of the school on 12th Street by the sidewalk is just unbelievable. People not being responsible pet owners, but I've heard there's more than one time people have come across the hypodermics syringes there by the schoolyard, but I appreciate that being taken care of. PEG Commission. Last night, Monday at the meeting, Dr. Brown, Keith Brown, who's been with the PEG for a long period of time, told the commission members that he is leaving the commission in June. So we're looking at a position description and some other things, and we'll try and get something hammered out very quickly in response to that timeline to try and find someone for the PEG Commission. But many years of good service. I'd like to thank everybody that has appeared and borne us out for the length of time we've been here for the meeting tonight. Thank you for the participation. With that, I have item D, consideration of closed session union contract negotiations. City Manager Thad Taylor has requested a closed session this evening as permitted by the Michigan Open Meeting Act, Section 8C, to discuss contract negotiations with the International Association of Firefighters, the Police Officers Association of Michigan, and the Command Officers Association of Michigan. At this time, council could take action to proceed to closed session under Section 8C of the Michigan Open Meeting Act.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Goodspeed, second by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski. Is there any discussion? Would you please take roll?
Councilmember Cooper.
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed.
Yes.
Mayor Smith.
Yes.
Councilmember Grabowski.
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac.
Yes.
Motion approved.
I
Need time to go potty.